Hey everyone, it's Jacqueline for Pixie Dust PhD. Today let's talk about the hidden cost of Disney Vacation Club. Of course, when you purchase Disney Vacation Club, there is your initial purchase price, but after that you have your annual dues. Your annual dues will really add up over time, over the whole life of your contract. So it's super important that we think about those when considering if financially Disney Vacation Club is a good idea or not. So after you purchase your Disney Vacation Club contract, you are going to owe fees every year. These are called your annual dues. You can pay them in a lump sum in January or pay them monthly as long as they're coming out of a direct debit from a US bank account. As part of DVC, you're actually an owner, so you can think about annual dues sort of like an HOA fee. These annual dues pay for general maintenance and upkeep of your home resort. And your annual dues are required as part of your contract every year. You won't simply be able to get out of them or negotiate out of them in any way. You will be paying annual dues if you're a DVC. Annual dues have set rates at every resort, and these do vary between resorts. Additionally, they also change year to year. For example, in 2019, For example, in 2019, the annual dues at the Grand Floridian were around $6.3 per point, meaning that if you had a 100-point contract, that would equate to over $630 for that year in annual dues. In contrast, annual dues at Vero Beach for the same year as that Grand Floridian example I just gave were just under $9.5 per point. So that means over $900 per year if you had a 100-point contract at Vero Beach just in annual dues. There definitely is variability in the amount of your dues between resorts. Annual dues rates are per point, meaning depending on the size of your contract or how many points you have every year, you'll owe a different amount of annual dues than a different owner at that same resort. For example, if I have a 100-point contract at a set resort and my friend has a 200-point contract at the same resort, every year my friend will owe twice as much in annual dues as I will. Points are essentially a slice of the ownership pie, and if you own more of those points, you own more of the pie, which also means you pay more in annual dues for annual upkeep. Hopefully, if you buy Disney Vacation Club, this is a long-term commitment for you. These contracts don't end for anywhere between 20 or 40 years from now. And while maybe you'll only keep it for 10 or 12 or whenever you're past your break-even point, hopefully you won't have to sell it much before that in order to really get your full value from it. For the purpose of this video, we'll be talking about the length of the full contract. And like I just mentioned, the expiration date for each resort varies. Let's stick with the Grand Floridian for this example. The expiration date of that contract is not until 2064. We can't predict with any certainty what annual dues will be like year over year. So for the sake of this argument, let's just pretend that the annual dues stay exactly the same rate that they are today. At Grand Floridian in 2020, the annual dues rate is just over $6.56 per point. Assuming you have a 100-point contract, we're just going to round down for ease and call that $650 per year. Now, since this contract doesn't expire until 2064, we're talking a good 40 years in the future. If you add up that $650 over all of the next 40 years, that's well over $25,000 just in annual dues. If you bought this Grand Floridian contract on the resale market, chances are good you did not pay $25,000 for your initial buy-in price. So of course your initial buy-in price is absolutely huge and often sticker shock for a lot of folks. You really want to consider the life of the contract where also your annual dues will add up to be even more than that in almost all instances. Note that in that last example, we were pretty generous and decided that annual dues would stay the same for the next 40 years. There wouldn't be any increase in annual dues. While we can't predict the future, this is highly unlikely. Historically, the change in annual dues is somewhat variable. Typically, it's only around a few percent, but there have been specific years where the jumps have been quite high. We're talking, $1 a point. In the past, some DVC annual dues have actually decreased from the prior year. This occurred between 1999 and 2001 at select resorts. However, we haven't seen a decrease since 2001. The rate of annual dues is likely set by supply and demand as well as the general market. So again, we really can't predict the future, but historical data surely suggests that on average, they will continue to go up. But even if the rate of increase of annual dues remains pretty low, a few percent, you're talking maybe 20 cents per point, that really adds up over 40 years. And furthermore, the example I gave was for a 100-point contract, which frankly is kind of a small contract. If you have 160, 180, or even more points to accommodate your entire family, well, your annual dues are going to be that much more. So after that primer about annual dues and the hidden costs it really adds up to for DVC, let's look at some actual data. Maybe you're looking for a very cheap DVC contract because you aren't at all picky about where you stay at Walt Disney World or what kind of accommodations you stay in, meaning the size of the room. If that's the case, you're probably going to go for Vero Beach. Direct through Disney, Vero Beach is $120 per point for your initial contract, And on the resale market, it averages to be about $70 per point. So if you bought a 100-point contract, again, this is kind of a small contract, but just for argument's sake and easy math, let's go with it. That's between $7,000 and $12,000, depending on if you buy resale or direct through Disney for your initial contract, without any associated fees for closing costs and whatnot. So that sounds pretty good for DVC. You get 100 points per year, and you're only spending up to $12 grand, really. That's not a bad deal in this realm. However, this is where that hidden cost comes in. So let's look at this graph. On the y-axis, you have annual dues. This is the number of dollars per point. And on the x-axis, we have the years. The data points between 1999 and 2020 are indicated in green, and this is actual data of the annual dues rate. You can find these historical rates online for any of the DVC resorts you're interested in.
The first method, let's calculate the percent change for the historical data. This is accomplished by taking the value from the current year minus the value from the prior year, divided by the value from the prior year, multiplied by 100. So you can see between 1999 and 2000, there was basically a 2% increase, and we can apply this to all of the historical data. Now let's go ahead and take the average of all of the percent changes. You get, on average, there's a 4.575-ish percent change from the historical data so far. And for this first simple model, we are just going to take that average yearly percent change that we calculated from the historical data and then apply that to all of the future years in the contract. In this case, because this expires in 2042, we will take this out until 2041, which is the last full year of the contract. In order to model future years, I'm going to take the historical value from 2020 and then account for the percent change to predict a 2021 value. And then we'll model that for the rest of the years as well. So now you can see these are the predicted values when using the percent change. We'll now plot those on the same graph in a bluish color. So if you had a 100-point contract, your annual dues are just going to be 100 multiplied by the dues per point. So this would be the amount of dues you would have already paid. And this is the amount of dues that you would be paying if we use this predictive percent change model. So now let's go ahead and get a total for the future amount of dues you would owe. We are just simply going to sum up the values from the first predictive model. And here you can see this sums to about $36,000. And that is without adjusting for inflation or anything. So briefly, money today is worth more than money tomorrow. We're not going to get deep into economic principles right now, but just know that this is a simplistic method and that doesn't necessarily represent the absolute value. So this is summing all of these points between 2021 and 2041, the amount of annual dues you would owe if every year on average dues rose about 4.5%.
But still, it's really not insignificant, and I think it demonstrates the point well. You need to be thinking about the lifetime cost of your annual dues when considering your financial situation and if DVC makes sense for you. Of course, there are dozens of ways to try to model the data and predict the future. That's a very simplistic one. Let's now go over another simplistic option, which is taking the treadline of the historic data. If we take that treadline from 1999 to 2020 of the actual annual dues rates at Vero Beach, and then use that equation and extend it out through 2041, you get a slightly different picture. So if we go back to the graph, I plotted the treadline here in gray.
Now, if you had a 100-point contract, these dues would come out to be this amount per year. And let's total that up from 2021 to 2041. The treadline model predicts significantly less dues overall over the course of life of the contract versus the percent change model. Of course, both of these models are flawed, and we don't know exactly what the lifetime dues will be for the contract, but by doing a simple exercise like this, even with very flawed models, you can mentally prepare yourself for how much this contract will cost over the life of the contract. In this case, somewhere between $25,000 and $35,000 probably. One thing to note about the treadline model is you can see that the equation is certainly flawed. For example, the 2021 dues rates is predicted to be 9.6387 versus the 2020 dues rate, which is currently set, that is real data, is 10.1257. The chances of that dipping are quite slim.
And none of these are perfect, and for all we know, they could be wildly inaccurate because, again, we can't predict the future. I do think this sort of exercise will help you prepare for what DVC will cost you in the long run. But Vero Beach may not be the best example since the annual dues rates are incredibly high at that property. So selfishly, I went ahead and did the same modeling for a couple of the other DVC resorts that I'm more interested in, and also have lower dues. At BoardWalk Villas, we have historical data from 1996 all the way through 2020. That again is plotted in green.
Let's calculate the percent change from the historic data. And then we'll take an average percent change over all of those years. So on average, the change in dues is about 2.93%. So now let's apply this to the future predicted years. And we'll do it again for 2022 through the end of the contract in 2041. So these are the predicted dues rates by using the percent change method. We'll go ahead and plot these here in a light blue. So now if you had a 100-point contract, this would be the amount of dues you would pay per year. And let's go ahead and sum those up from 2021 through the end of your contract 2041. So this is just about $21,000 by this method. Now instead, let's go ahead and do the treadline method. And these are the predicted dues from the treadline method, which we'll plot in light gray. And again, if you had a 100-point contract, this would be the amount of dues you would pay every year as predicted by this model without adjusting for inflation or anything similar. And so that amount of money yearly over time will sum to just under $18,000. So again, these two models come up with different numbers, albeit this time significantly less different than we saw in Vero Beach.
Here's this exercise for Beach Club Villas. We have actual data from 2002 to 2020 for the annual dues rates, again plotted in green.
Here's the percent change, and here's the average for all of the years that we have historical data for. It's about 3.5%. So now let's go ahead and apply that percent change to the future years. So this is the predicted amount of dues per point that you would be paying in the future. And we will plot that in blue. And if you had a 100-point contract, this is the amount you would be paying each year. For the life of the contract, that will sum to just over $22,000 by this predictive model. Next, let's do the treadline method. And we will plot this in gray. And then a 100-point contract would result in this amount of dues being paid yearly by this treadline prediction. And the total of that for the life of the contract is just over $18,500. The treadline again is more conservative than the percent change method. This makes perfect mathematical sense, but this can give you a good idea of roughly about where your dues might fall in the future.
Now, so far all of these contracts have ended in 2042. However, not all DVC contracts end that year. You can make an argument that you'll get better value out of a contract that ends later in time. However, you still do need to be prepared to pay dues for all of that time if you plan on keeping the contract that long. So let's look at Bay Lake Tower, which expires in 2060. We have historical data for Bay Lake Tower annual dues rates from 2009 through 2020, again here plotted in green.
Calculating the percent change for the historical data for Bay Lake Tower, which opened in 2009, so we do have less data to go off of so far. The average percent change over all of the years is just under 5.5%. So let's go ahead and apply that average percent change to the future years. And we'll take this out through the end of the contract, or at least the last full year of the contract, which will be 2059, as this doesn't expire until 2060. We'll plot this in a light blue. So now you can see this in blue, quite the dramatic increase over time. If you have a 100-point contract, these are the amount of dues you would owe yearly per this percent change model. And then let's go ahead and look at the total. So let's look at the total through 2059 as well as the total through 2041. That way you may be able to more easily compare to some of the other examples we've done today, which end in 2041. So this predicts almost $90,000 in dues if you take the full contract out through 2059, which is quite a large number. And then 2041. 2041, you're talking about $26,000, so not too different from BoardWalk or Beach Club. Now let's do the treadline method, which doesn't suffer from this exponential curve syndrome. I'm going to add the treadline, display the equation on the chart, and use this. And we will take this out through the end of the contract. Those don't exist. And we will plot this in a light gray. And so you can see with the treadline, you don't at all get this exponential curve. It just assumes a linear rise over time. And we don't know what it'll be. Honestly, I think it'll be between these two somewhere, but here it just gives you a good idea of what you may face in the future. So for a 100-point contract, that would result in this amount of money being paid per year in dues. And let's look at two totals again. We'll do 2059 as well as 2041. So the total sum for a 100-point contract, this predicts now under $50,000 versus the exponential curve you can see predicts for almost $90,000. That's a huge difference. And now we will do, and this is just through 2041. So you can see again, the trend line is much more conservative than the percent change model, which results in an exponential curve increase. All four resorts that we've modeled today have the historical data plotted first in green and then two predictive models coming off of that. The light blue is the percent change, which has this exponential curve factor to it, and that mathematically makes sense, but it may not predict the future very well. And then the gray is just taking the trend line out, so completely linear. A completely linear rise also may not predict the future very well. But you can see the dramatic difference between the blue and the gray, especially when you take it out over time, like as in the later years in Bay Lake Tower. The purchase price for Beach Club, BoardWalk, and Bay Lake Tower, that is your initial buy-in price, is going to be a large chunk of money. It's definitely not insignificant. As opposed to Vero Beach, your purchase price will be much less, potentially even half as much or less than some of these other resorts. That being said, you do owe dues at all of the resorts, and that certainly does add up. So even in something like Vero Beach, where your initial buy-in price is very low, because the dues at Vero Beach are so high, you may be paying a ton in dues over time. For example, even the treadline model for Vero Beach predicts about $26,000 over the life of the contract, which is the same amount of time for BoardWalk or Beach Club, which are hovering around the $18,000 mark instead.
So overall, of course, the initial purchase price of DVC, either on the resale market or direct through Disney, is a ton of money. You're talking typically over $20,000, especially if you have a larger contract. That being said, I think it's really important that you think about your annual dues as well. While $20,000 now certainly is expensive, you're talking about probably that amount or more over the lifetime of your contract as well. This effectively doubles the price of Disney Vacation Club. And that's just pure price. We aren't even touching on economic theories like opportunity cost, where had you had that money instead and perhaps invested it in your retirement or in the stock market, how much that money could have grown in that time and what you would have been able to do with it otherwise. I'm assuming if you're watching this, you're somewhat seriously considering DVC, meaning that it has value to you, and so some of those economic principles don't matter as much. And an additional minor note is that there are also late fees associated with annual dues if you can't pay them on time, which of course will also add up over time. Another factor to consider when internalizing these examples is these were all based off a 100-point contract, which is relatively small. Chances are decent that your contract will probably be more points than that, which means even more money, not only initially, but especially over time for your annual dues. And a last note to avoid any confusion. Annual dues are based on calendar year, not your use year. So you do not need to factor your use year into thinking about any of this. If you don't know what a use year is or need a refresher, go ahead and check out this video I did. Should all this information deter you from buying Disney Vacation Club? No, absolutely not. I just think it's super important to arm people with the information to make smart decisions for themselves. How much have you thought about annual dues? Did they factor at all into if you have or have not bought DVC yet? Or even better, did they factor into which home resort you picked? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. If you found these graphs and information helpful, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Ring the bell icon to get notifications whenever I post new videos. If you found this math helpful, definitely let me know in the comments. I enjoyed doing it, and I thought that it was really helpful for weighing my own decisions, and I would love to keep exploring these topics if you find them interesting. Until then, we'll see you real soon at Pixie Dust PhD.